Camilla reportedly went down before the Privy Council had even finished reading the proclamation out loud. And the detail almost everyone is rushing past is this. The document confirming William's new royal title had already been signed, sealed, and formally logged before Camilla was even told a council session had been scheduled. That one fact turns the palace's polished little statement into something that looks a lot more like damage control than transparency. Because think about it. If this was nothing more than a ceremonial rubber stamp, a formality everyone saw coming, then nobody drops. Nobody grips the wall for balance. Nobody has to be half carried out of a side corridor by two equerries while the king sits perfectly still, not even turning his head. And William, if the accounts now circulating are accurate, didn't smile, didn't exhale in relief. He pressed both palms flat against the table, stared at the document in front of him, and looked over at Charles like a son who had just watched a door close that could never be reopened. That reaction tells you this was never a celebration, it was a severing. Before we walk through the timeline that doesn't line up and the contradictions the palace is praying you won't notice, take 2 seconds to subscribe and switch on notifications so you don't miss the next development, because this story is moving faster than anyone inside those walls can contain it. Now here's where the official version starts to wobble. The palace line is that the Privy Council simply formalized a title transfer that had been agreed upon well in advance, a smooth, mutually understood step in a carefully managed transition. But the very same people describing Camilla's collapse are also confirming that Charles's signature appeared on the preparatory instrument of transfer nearly a week before the public announcement, which means the process was already in motion while Camilla still believed the decision was open for negotiation. She walked into that chamber thinking she was attending a conversation. She was actually attending the consequences of a verdict that had been reached without her. And the moment that landed, the moment she understood the paperwork predated her involvement entirely, her body simply stopped cooperating. Not because William receiving the title shocked her. She had known that day would come for years. It was because she realized, in real time, that the one man she believed she could still reach had already closed the door on her. And that distinction is everything. The palace wants this sold as a gracious, orderly handover between a devoted husband and a supportive wife. But if Charles had genuinely been preparing Camilla for this outcome, if he had truly brought her along step by step the way the statement implies, she would not have crumpled like someone who had just been ambushed in her own home. The sequence of events simply does not support the story they are telling. And once you lay what was announced next to what actually happened, the gap between them becomes impossible to unsee. 9 days before the council convened, Camilla requested a private audience with Charles at Clarence's house. According to those familiar with the meeting, she asked him to postpone any formal transfer for at least another year, maybe 2. Her argument was built around his health. She insisted that accelerating the transition would place unbearable strain on a man who was already carrying more than his doctors were comfortable with. She told him that rest was not defeat, that slowing down was not surrender, and Charles did not debate her. He did not raise his voice or defend his reasoning. He simply listened, removed his reading glasses, set them down on top of the papers she had brought with her, and told her that some decisions could no longer be made inside a marriage. They had to be made inside the institution. That same evening, before dinner was even served, he placed a call to the officials responsible for convening the council. The drafting began that night. The signatures were gathered within days, so by the time Camilla stepped into that council room in her formal attire, prepared to make her case one final time, the case no longer existed. The ink was dry, the wheels had turned, and the only person in the building who hadn't been informed was the woman married to the man who set it all in motion. That is why she fell. It wasn't performance. It wasn't fainting for sympathy. It was the involuntary physical collapse of someone watching 30 years of influence evaporate in a single sentence. And what people keep coming back to, the detail that still chills everyone who hears it, is that Charles never got up. He didn't rise from his chair. He didn't call for help. He placed his pen down with extraordinary calm, watched his son absorb the moment, and allowed his wife to be guided out of the room by staff. That is not the behavior of a man surprised by events. That is the behavior of a man who had already grieved this moment in private, and was now simply watching it arrive. But here is the part that complicates everything. The piece that keeps getting flattened in the retelling. William did not know the data either. The future king understood the transition was approaching. Everyone in the family did. But he had been deliberately excluded from the final scheduling discussions. Charles made sure of it. And the reasoning, according to what is now being reported, was almost painfully protective. Charles did not want a single document, a single email, a single conversation that could ever be used to suggest William had maneuvered his own father off the throne. He wanted the historical record to show one thing and one thing only, that the decision belonged to the outgoing king alone. It is an admirable instinct, but it also means William sat in that chamber carrying the same uncertainty as everyone else present, right up until the moment the weight of the crown dropped onto his shoulders with zero emotional runway. And when William finally found his voice, he did not ask about his new powers, his new household, his new authority. He looked at his father and asked if this was truly what he wanted. That question, that specific question, is what transforms this from a story about ambition into a story about loss. Charles did not answer it directly. He straightened the edges of the documents in front of him, held his son's gaze, and said that what any of them wanted had stopped being relevant a long time ago. It is a line that sounds like wisdom. It will be printed in history books. But listen to what it actually does. It sidesteps the question completely. William asked about want. Charles answered about inevitability. Those are two entirely different things. And a father who cannot look at his son and say, yes, this is what I want, is a father telling you, without saying it, that this decision cost him more than he will ever admit publicly. Then came the confrontation almost nobody outside the family knows about. Later that afternoon, after Camilla had been helped to a private sitting room and given time to compose herself, she asked for William. Not Charles, William. And this is where the story stops being about councils and constitutions and becomes something far more human. She asked him directly whether he believed she had tried to block his path to the throne. William did not answer immediately. He poured her a glass of water, set it within her reach, and said that was never the part that troubled him. What troubled him was that she had tried to make the decision for Charles, as if his father were no longer capable of choosing his own ending. That reframe matters enormously, because it flips the entire conflict on its head. This was never about William hungering for a crown. It was about whether Camilla had the right to manage Charles's ability to surrender one. And William said it to her face, in language she could not misinterpret. He told her there is a difference between standing beside someone and standing in front of them, deciding what they are allowed to face. That sentence hit its mark because it was impossible to argue with. Camilla had genuinely convinced herself she was shielding her husband. What she was actually doing, whether she could see it or not, was shielding her own position inside a structure that was about to be rebuilt without her. And William saw it with painful clarity. Then Camilla revealed the suspicion she had been carrying for weeks. She admitted she had asked Charles whether Catherine's expanding public role had accelerated the timetable, whether the palace was fast-tracking William because the Princess of Wales was ready for a bigger stage. And that is when William's expression reportedly shifted from controlled to genuinely taken aback. He told her Catherine had not known the date, had not spoken to Charles about the schedule, and had never once lobbied for the transition to move faster. That answer quietly demolished the theory Camilla had been using to make sense of it all. Because she had been searching for a villain. She wanted it to be Catherine's ambition, or William's impatience, or a circle of sharp-elbowed advisors whispering in the king's ear. Any explanation would have been easier than the truth. The truth was that Charles had reached this decision entirely on his own, in silence, without her counsel, without her warning, without her. And that was the blow she could not absorb. Because Camilla had spent decades at the side of a man defined by waiting. She knew better than anyone alive what the crown meant to him, how long he had endured, how much of his identity had been built around finally holding it. She had constructed her entire understanding of him on the assumption that he would never willingly let it go. So when he did, and when he did it in secret, the foundation underneath her did not crack. It gave way completely. This was not really about losing access to briefing papers and approval chains. It was about discovering that the person she knew most intimately had made the most agonizing choice of his life in a room she was never invited into. That is not a constitutional crisis. That is a wound inside a marriage. And still, the machine did not pause for even a day. By the following morning, William's office was already absorbing sovereign responsibilities. Documents that had spent weeks awaiting Charles's attention were rerouted within hours. Invitations requiring royal approval began landing on William's desk. Decisions that had belonged to one man for years now required another man's initials. And Camilla felt the transition in the smallest, coldest ways first. She arrived for a standing engagement review and discovered the item had vanished from her schedule entirely. When she asked why, her private secretary quietly explained that such matters now fell under William's authority. She looked at the blank space in her diary for a long moment, closed the cover, and asked for the afternoon alone. That empty slot wounded her more than the proclamation ever could, because it proved the transfer was not symbolic. Nobody announced it, nobody explained it. The calendar simply changed, and she was expected to change with it. Charles understood exactly what was happening to her. He saw the isolation setting in, watched her orbit shrink day by day, and made a deliberate choice not to step in. because he knew that if he intervened during the first fragile days of William's authority, he would be undermining his son before the new reign had even found its footing. So he offered tenderness behind closed doors and firmness in front of the institution, and he never once blurred the two. That is an extraordinarily difficult line for any husband to walk, and it is a large part of why this transition feels so much colder than the official photographs suggest. Charles is still there. He is still honored, still consulted on matters of ceremony. But the machinery no longer pauses for his signature, and Camilla is left suspended between two versions of herself, the woman she spent decades becoming and the woman she is now required to be. Then William did something nobody predicted. He issued a quiet instruction to the senior household. Camilla was not to be diminished. Her personal staff were not to be reassigned without her consent. The transfer of authority was not to be interpreted by anyone as an invitation to settle old scores. That instruction mattered more than any public gesture could have, because it drew a hard line between restructuring an institution and punishing a person. William wanted a transition that was decisive, not vindictive. When word of the directive reached Camilla, she was reportedly stunned. She had braced herself for restrictions. She had braced herself for quiet revenge dressed up as protocol. Instead, the man she had tried to delay chose to protect her dignity even as he dismantled her influence. That is a very particular kind of strength. It is measured, it is intentional, and it forced Camilla to ask herself whether she had fundamentally misjudged William from the very beginning. A few days later, William asked to see her privately. No private secretaries, no advisors waiting outside the door, no papers on the table between them. Just two people who had been standing on opposite sides of the same grief. And this is the conversation the headlines never found. William told her that being called king had not felt like winning anything. It felt like watching a part of his father quietly disappear while the world waited for him to smile for the cameras. He said he had trained for the role his entire life, studied it, prepared for it. But no preparation in the world teaches a son how to stand next to his father while power drains out of one generation and pools around the feet of the next. That is why the day hurt. Because every elevation in this family is purchased with someone else's surrender. Camilla listened without interrupting, and for the first time since the council chamber, she did not reach for protocol or precedent, or the argument she had been rehearsing for months. She told him the truth. She said her resistance had never really been about the timetable. It had been about terror. She was terrified of what would happen to Charles once he set down the identity that had organized his entire existence. She had watched him wait a lifetime for the role. Watching him release it felt like watching him dissolve. William let her finish every word. He did not correct her, did not defend the process, did not point out that her fear had nearly fractured the family. He simply waited until she was done, and then he told her the one thing she had not expected to hear. Her place beside his father was not his to take. Her formal role would evolve, because the structure surrounding the crown had evolved. But her place in Charles's life was not something any title, any council, any instrument of transfer could ever revoke. He wanted a monarchy that was firm in its decisions and decent in its treatment of the people those decisions touched. And that is where the simple villain story falls apart. Because yes, Camilla fought the inevitable. Yes, she positioned herself against William's ascension and worked quietly to slow it down. But when the moment arrived, and William held all the power, he did not use it against her. He built a fence around her dignity instead of a wall around her future. And Camilla, to her credit, finally said the thing out loud. She admitted that postponing the transfer had stopped being about protecting Charles somewhere along the way. It had become about protecting herself from a future she could not picture. That is a brutally honest thing to confess, and it reframes the whole conflict one final time. Because this was never purely about power. It was about fear. Fear of becoming invisible. Fear of watching the person you love be consumed by a role that leaves nothing behind. Fear of turning into a footnote in a story you sacrificed everything to be part of. Meanwhile, beyond the palace gates, the narrative had already taken on a life of its own. Networks called it the smoothest generational handover in modern memory. Royal commentators praised Charles's selflessness and marveled at how swiftly William had assumed command. The palace released a statement engineered to within an inch of its life, heavy with words like continuity, unity, and gratitude. Every sentence was careful, because everyone writing it knew the reality inside those walls was still bleeding. The family was emotionally chasing a transition that the paperwork had completed days earlier. Charles, notably, watched almost none of the coverage. He caught a few minutes of a panel discussing the end of his reign, switched off the television, and asked an aide whether William's first week of engagements had been finalized. That tiny detail reveals the entire man. He was not anxious about how history would grade his departure. He was anxious about whether his son was sleeping. The title had transferred. The father had not. William, for his part, found the public euphoria almost unbearable. Crowds gathered outside the palace chanting his name. One front page, held up above the barriers, carried his portrait under a headline announcing the new era in letters the size of a fist. Directly beneath it, in a far smaller frame, was a photograph of Charles climbing into a car after his final session as sovereign. Triumph and mourning sharing the same sheet of paper. William felt the wrongness of that ratio in his stomach. He knew precisely what had been surrendered so that headline could exist, and the cheering sounded like it was coming from a country that did not understand the price. It was Catherine who steadied him. She told him he was not required to perform gratitude for a day that had also broken something. He could carry his father's sacrifice with reverence and still step into the duty without apology. That is the voice that keeps a moment like this from curdling into theater. Camilla, meanwhile, began reshaping her own public position. Palace messaging quietly made clear that she would remain at Charles's side in every personal sense, even as her institutional footprint contracted. She was no longer being presented as the woman who resisted, or the woman who fell. She was being presented as a consort navigating the same painful closing of an era as everyone else in the family. That repositioning is deliberate and frankly generous. It keeps her visible without casting her as an obstacle to the new order. And it proves that William's instruction about dignity was not empty language. She was not written out of the story. She was written into a different chapter. But the moment that will outlive every headline happened in private, minutes before William's first appearance as king. Charles asked to see his son alone. He straightened William's collar with the same hands that had signed away the throne, stepped back to look at him, and said that from this day forward he never needed to ask anyone's permission to lead again. William did not deliver a speech. He did not say anything at all. He simply put his arms around his father and held him, and for a few seconds the crown meant nothing and the two of them were just what they had always been. That is the image the palace should have printed, not the collapse, not the documents, not the council chamber. A father and a son in an empty room, one of them releasing the heaviest object in the country, the other agreeing to carry it. The transfer was complete in that embrace, not because any proclamation said so, but because one man chose to let go with grace and the other chose to accept it without pretending it didn't hurt. Camilla came to Charles afterward, just the two of them, no staff, no schedule. She admitted that her collapse had never really been about influence or access or the politics of the whole thing. It had been the moment she understood that the life they had built together ended inside a single sentence read aloud in a council chamber. She had not known what would remain of them once the structure fell away. Charles took her hand and told her that they had not lost their life together. They had only lost the job that had been borrowing it. That answer gave her something no title ever had. Whether she believed it completely, in that moment, is a question only she can answer. But it was enough to stand back up on. And in the weeks that followed, William honored every word of his earlier instruction. Camilla's formal authority contracted, exactly as the structure demanded, but she was never degraded, never isolated, never treated as an adversary who had been defeated. Catherine stood beside the new king as the public face of what came next. Charles withdrew voluntarily, on his own terms, in his own handwriting. And the transfer was completed not through conquest but through something far rarer in that family. One generation choosing to release its grip, and the next choosing to receive the weight without arrogance. That is the part the screaming headlines will never capture. This was not a coup. It was not a betrayal. It was an aging man concluding that the institution he had waited a lifetime to lead needed stability more than it needed his continued presence on the throne. And it was everyone around him absorbing that decision the only way human beings can, messily, privately, and at great personal cost. Camilla fell because she discovered she had been excluded from the single most consequential choice of her husband's life. William hesitated because he understood exactly what the gift he was receiving had cost the man giving it. Charles remained still because his grief had already happened in silence, long before the cameras and the councils and the signatures. And the palace pressed forward because institutions have never once waited for the people inside them to finish breaking. The machinery does not care who is crying in the private sitting rooms. It needs the next approval, the next engagement, the next name on the next document. So when you strip the whole story down to its frame, it was never really about the Privy Council handing William a title. It was about what that title extracted from every person standing in the room when it happened. Charles surrendered the role that had defined his entire existence. Camilla lost the proximity to power she had spent 3 decades building. William inherited a crown and felt it pressing down on the most important relationship of his life before the first day was even over. The title was real. The authority was immediate. But the emotional wreckage kept unfolding long after the broadcasters packed up their cameras and the crowds drifted home. And that is why the sequence of events matters so much. The signature dated nearly a week earlier. the private plea at Clarence House, the argument Camilla believed was still winnable, the announcement she never saw coming. None of it was improvisation. Charles had made his choice long before anyone else knew a choice had been made. He simply kept it from the people who loved him most. And whether that was protection or cruelty is a question the family is probably still asking itself tonight. That is the contradiction sitting at the center of everything. The palace wanted the world to see a seamless, dignified handover, but the people inside it are still nursing wounds from how fast the ground moved. William wears the crown now. Charles is sovereign no longer. Camilla remains standing, but the floor she is standing on belongs to a different reign. And the one thing nobody in that family can deny is that nothing about this transition was ever as orderly as the statement claimed. The crown changed heads in a single morning. The family is still catching up, and the quiet coming from those private rooms says more than any proclamation ever will.